Okay, so today we're diving deep into something pretty wild. Making humans, like, way smarter. And I mean significantly smarter, not just a little boost. We're talking about the kind of intelligence leap that could redefine what it means to be human. We're tackling this with an article from LessWrong called Overview of Strong Human Intelligence Amplification Methods. The author, TsviBT, really digs into the weeds on this one.
Yeah, it's not just your typical what if we all had super brains kind of article.
Definitely not.
It actually tries to lay out different approaches, assess how feasible they are with current science, and even considers potential downsides.
Right from the start, the article hits you with that question. If getting seriously smarter is even possible, why hasn't evolution already gotten us there? Why aren't we all walking around with these super brains naturally?
That's the whole Algernon's law thing.
Hmm.
Basically, it says if superintelligence was just a matter of bigger, better brains, evolution would figure that out a long time ago.
Right, survival of the fittest and all that.
Exactly. The fact that we're not all geniuses already suggests there are probably some serious trade-offs or built-in limitations that evolution had to deal with.
Like maybe those super brains would require a massive amount of energy or make us more prone to certain diseases or even just make childbirth more difficult. Evolution tends to favor what's practical.
Right. Evolution optimizes for what helps us survive and reproduce, not necessarily for pure intellectual power.
So how do we get around that?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. This article doesn't just throw up its hands and say, Algernon's law, game over. TsviBT argues that humans, with our tools and knowledge, might be able to bypass some of those limitations that constrained evolution.
So we're talking about hacking our own evolution in a way.
Kind of, yeah. We're no longer bound by that slow, gradual process of natural selection. We can be more deliberate, more targeted.
And the article digs into some pretty mind-blowing ways to do that. One category that jumps out is what it calls direct brain enhancement. That sounds a little intense, right?
It does sound like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. But at its core, it's about directly manipulating the brain, either at the genetic level or through more physical interventions. It gets broken down further into what the article calls genomic approaches and then physical biological manipulation.
Let's start with the genomic stuff. That seems to be where a lot of the buzz is these days.
For sure. And the article zeroes in on what might be the most powerful tool in this category. Germline engineering. We're talking about actually editing genes linked to intelligence, not just in one person, but in a way that gets passed down to their kids and their kids' kids and so on.
So instead of just boosting one person's brain power, you're basically trying to raise the baseline intelligence of the whole human species.
Exactly. It's a pretty profound idea when you think about it.
It's like we're talking about taking evolution into our own hands. What about those polygenic scores for IQ I've heard about? How do they fit into all this?
Think of polygenic scores as a way to predict someone's likelihood of having a certain trait, like intelligence, based on their genes. Scientists have found many genes that play a role in intelligence, and these scores help us understand how those genes work together.
So theoretically, you could use these scores to select embryos that are more likely to be, well, really smart.
That's one potential application, yeah.
Yeah.
It highlights the potential and the ethical complexities of these genomic tools. But germline editing is all about those future generations. What about people who are already alive? Can we tweak their genes to boost their intelligence?
Yeah, is it too late once the brain is fully developed?
Not necessarily. The article does talk about the possibility of editing genes in adult brains, but it points out some major roadblocks. First off, getting those gene editing tools safely into the brain is a huge challenge.
Makes sense. The brain is really good at protecting itself. I imagine that ethical issues are even more complicated when you're talking about changing the brains of people who are already alive and making their own choices.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But beyond even the ethics and the delivery problem, the article suggests that editing adult brains probably wouldn't be as impactful as those germline changes. We're talking about maybe a 2 or 3 standard deviation bump in IQ compared to the possibility of much larger shifts with germline engineering.
Interesting. So while still a significant improvement, it might not be the total game changer that some people imagine. The article also mentions this other technique, massive neural transplantation. Now that sounds intense.
It does, right? We're starting to get into the really speculative stuff here. Basically, the idea is to grow new brain cells in a lab and then transplant them into an existing brain, almost like adding more processing power.
Sounds incredibly complex, both
Right.
technically and ethically. Are we even close to being able to do something like that?
Not really, no.
Yeah.
The article acknowledges the huge hurdles here. Growing functional brain tissue in the lab is one thing, but then you have to figure out how to integrate those new cells into the brain's existing intricate network without causing serious problems. It's more science fiction than science fact right now.
Okay, so maybe hold off on signing up for that brain transplant waiting list. What about these signaling molecules? That sounds a bit less like something out of Frankenstein.
It does. Instead of trying to add new hardware, this approach is about potentially optimizing the software already running in our brains.
So instead of transplanting new brain cells, it's about making the existing cells communicate and work together more effectively.
Exactly. Our brains rely on these complex networks of signaling molecules. They're like chemical messengers that control all sorts of brain functions.
So if we could identify and manipulate the specific signaling molecules that affect things like learning, memory, or problem solving, we could potentially boost those abilities without messing with the brain's physical structure.
Precisely. And because we're talking about naturally occurring molecules, this approach could be less invasive and risky than some of the others we've discussed, in theory at least.
It sounds promising, but I'm guessing we're still a long way from popping a pill to boost our IQ, right?
Right. While there's been some interesting research, it's still super early. And anytime you're talking about messing with the delicate balance of the brain, there's always the potential for unintended consequences. We're dealing with a system we still don't fully understand.
So while those direct brain interventions are fascinating and a bit mind-boggling, it sounds like there are some pretty big hurdles to clear, both scientifically and ethically.
For sure. And that's why it's so interesting that the article explores other paths as well. Approaches that don't involve directly altering the brain's biology, but could still lead to significant gains in intelligence.
I'm all ears. What's next on the list?
Well, we've talked about enhancing the brain's hardware, but what about focusing on its software and connectivity? That's where the article's next category comes in. Brain interface technologies.
Okay, so instead of going in and rewiring the brain directly, we're talking about creating external devices or systems that can interact with it in powerful new ways. I'm intrigued.
Exactly. These interfaces could let us boost our brain power by basically expanding our brain's connections, like linking up with other brains or even external computers.
Okay, so are we talking about brain-computer interfaces here, BCIs?
We're in that ballpark, but the article takes it a step further with this idea of massive cerebral prosthetic connectivity. Imagine boosting the connections within your brain using implants. Instead of just one BCI, it's like creating a superhighway of information flow between different parts of your brain.
So instead of being limited by how our brains are wired naturally, we could give those internal communication channels a massive upgrade.
That's the gist of it, yeah. But here's a curveball. The author is actually skeptical of our good old BCIs when it comes to really amping up intelligence.
Really? Why is that? I thought BCIs were showing a lot of promise.
They are, but maybe not for this specific goal. The article argues that when it comes to really complex thought, BCIs might be hitting a wall. One issue is bandwidth, how much information they can actually transfer. We're nowhere near the level needed to really supercharge things like abstract reasoning or creativity.
So it's not as easy as just plugging in and downloading knowledge like in the Matrix.
Not quite. Even if we had the bandwidth, we still don't completely understand how to interface with the brain to meaningfully enhance things like reasoning or problem solving. It's not just about the data itself, it's about how that data is integrated and actually used by the brain.
Okay, so directly plugging our brains into computers might not be the golden ticket, at least not yet. What about other brain interface ideas? The article mentions a couple that sound straight out of science fiction.
It definitely goes there. One concept is the human-human brain interface. Picture this. Directly linking two minds together, not through language, but through a neural connection.
Like a Vulcan mind meld. That's both fascinating and a little freaky.
It's definitely out there. The idea is that this connection could allow for communication or collaboration that goes way beyond what words can do. Imagine sharing not just thoughts, but emotions, gut feelings, even unconscious processes.
It'd be like combining our intelligence with someone else's, amplifying it. But how would that even work in real life? Wouldn't it just be total chaos, like having two conversations happening in your head at once?
That's the million-dollar question. We don't know if our brains can even handle that kind of input in any meaningful way. The article acknowledges these challenges, but it also makes a compelling case for why this type of interface could unlock new levels of cognitive synergy.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. What about that other sci-fi concept, connecting with lab-grown brain tissue?
Yeah, that one definitely pushes the boundaries. Imagine hooking up a living brain to a network of lab-grown neurons, essentially trying to expand its processing power externally.
So instead of transplanting new brain tissue directly into the brain, we're talking about creating an external network that interacts with the existing brain.
You got it. And the thinking is that because these external networks could theoretically be grown to a much larger scale, this approach might be more practical than trying to physically cram more neurons into the skull.
That makes sense, theoretically. But can we even grow functional networks of neurons in a lab that are sophisticated enough to actually do anything useful?
That's the big question, isn't it? We've made some progress with things like brain organoids, which are like mini simplified versions of organs, but we're a long way from replicating the full complexity of a human brain.
So while the concept is super interesting, it seems like we're still in the very early stages of research.
Definitely. These brain interface technologies are still highly speculative. There are massive technical, ethical, and logistical challenges to overcome before they become a reality.
It definitely feels like we've been wading into some deep and sometimes murky waters with these direct brain interventions. Are there any approaches the article discusses that feel a bit more grounded, maybe even achievable in the near term?
There are, and this next category is particularly relevant to what you mentioned earlier about exploring practical ways to enhance intelligence. The article calls this category support for thinking.
Support for thinking that has a much less brain surgery ring to it. Tell me more.
That's the beauty of this approach. It's not about fundamentally changing the brain itself, but more about giving it the right tools, strategies, and support to function at its best.
So instead of trying to upgrade the hardware directly, it's more about optimizing the software or even creating a better operating system for the brain.
Perfect analogy. The article breaks this category down further into three subcategories: external support, mental software, and social software.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's break those down. What exactly do they mean by external support?
This one's the most straightforward. Think of it as all the tools and technologies we use to offload cognitive tasks, freeing up our brains to focus on the bigger picture. Things like calculators, computers, even good old-fashioned pencil and paper.
Those are things we often take for granted, but they've really revolutionized how we think and learn. Imagine trying to do complex math without a calculator or organize your thoughts without writing them down.
Exactly. The article argues that we've been developing and refining these external support systems for centuries. The printing press is a great example. It totally changed how we stored and shared information, which led to a huge boom in knowledge and new ideas.
And what about more recent examples? I bet the internet has had a massive impact on how we think.
For sure. The internet, with its instant access to so much information, has become a crucial external support system for a lot of us.
It's like having a library, a university, and a global communication network all rolled into one easily accessible platform. No wonder it feels like our brains are on overdrive these days.
That's a good point. And it shows how these external support systems can be both a blessing and a curse. They can boost our cognitive abilities, but they can also lead to information overload and constant distractions.
Finding the balance is key. I guess harnessing those tools effectively without letting them take over our lives.
Exactly. But let's move on to mental software. What do you think this one might be about?
Mental software, it sounds like it's all about the mental techniques and strategies we use to think more effectively. Things like critical thinking, problem-solving skills, maybe even memory techniques.
You nailed it. The article argues that just like any skill, these mental techniques can be learned and honed. There's a lot of research now on how we can improve our cognitive abilities through training and practice.
So it's not just about being born smart, it's also about developing the right mental habits and skills to learn and think more effectively.
Exactly. It's about building those cognitive muscles. And like physical exercise, mental exercise can make your mind stronger and more flexible.
That makes a lot of sense. The more I challenge myself intellectually, the more I'm able to learn new things and process information more easily.
I hear that. But this category isn't only about individual effort. The article also talks about social software, the social structures and interactions that can shape and boost our intelligence.
Social software. Now that's an intriguing term. What does that mean exactly?
Think about it this way. Our brains don't exist in isolation. How we think is shaped by the people around us, the communities we're part of, the broader systems we live in.
So intelligence isn't just an individual thing. It's also influenced by our social environment and how we collaborate and learn from each other.
Exactly. And the article suggests that we can design social structures and systems that actually promote and enhance collective intelligence.
So things like research groups, online forums, collaborative workspaces, those are all examples of social software. They can help amplify our individual intelligence by connecting us to a wider pool of knowledge and different ways of thinking.
Exactly. These systems allow us to share what we know, build on each other's ideas, and work together in ways that we couldn't if we were all just working by ourselves.
It's like the old saying, two heads are better than one, but on a much larger scale.
Right. And as the world becomes even more interconnected, these social software systems are only going to become more crucial in shaping and boosting human intelligence.
It's pretty exciting to think about the possibilities. But out of all these different approaches we've talked about, from gene editing to brain interfaces to these support for thinking methods, what stands out to you as the most promising? And given that these advancements could be really disruptive, what should we be thinking about as we explore this whole realm of human intelligence amplification?
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's like we've been going through a buffet of intelligence-boosting ideas, and they all have their own flavors and potential side effects. If you had to pick the most promising approaches, where would you place your bets?
It's tough to compare, for sure. It's like asking which is more useful, a hammer or a microscope. But I think those support for thinking methods, particularly the ones focused on external support and mental software, offer the most immediate opportunities. They do seem more within reach, both in terms of what we can actually do and what feels ethically sound right now. We're already seeing amazing things happening with AI, personalized learning, even brain-computer interfaces to a degree.
Exactly. And while those technologies aren't specifically designed to make us smarter, they have the potential to dramatically change how we think, how we learn, how we solve problems. It's almost like we're already augmenting our intelligence without even realizing it.
It makes you wonder where we'll be in 10, 20 years, even without intentionally trying to create super geniuses. What about those more sci-fi ideas we talked about, though? The brain-to-brain interfaces, tapping into lab-grown neurons. Are those even realistic, or should we file those under fun to think about but not going to happen?
It's hard to rule anything out completely, especially with how fast technology moves these days. But those approaches face some massive obstacles. With those brain-brain interfaces, just the technical challenges are mind-boggling. We're nowhere near being able to reliably and safely decode and influence individual neurons, let alone transfer complex thoughts and emotions between people.
And even if we could do it, the ethics are incredibly thorny. How do you even begin to deal with consent and individual agency when you're talking about technology that could blur the lines between people's minds?
Exactly. It's a fascinating thought experiment, but it raises a whole Pandora's box of ethical questions that we're not equipped to handle at this point.
And connecting with those lab-grown neurons, any hope for that one becoming a reality?
The technical hurdles there might be even bigger. We've had some success growing those simplified brain organoids, but they're nowhere near as complex as a real functioning human brain.
So maybe those are challenges for future generations to tackle. But even with the more short-term advancements, we can't ignore the potential downsides. The article mentions this risk of value drift. What exactly is that, and why should we be concerned about it?
Value drift is this idea that as we become more intelligent, our values, our goals might change too. What matters to us, how we see the world, even how we define something like morality. It's all shaped by our current cognitive abilities.
So you're saying there's no guarantee that if we boost our intelligence, our values will evolve in a positive way? What could that look like in the real world?
Imagine a world where people with significantly enhanced intelligence start seeing things so differently from everyone else that their goals and motivations seem totally alien to us.
So instead of a utopia where everyone's smarter and making better decisions, we could end up with a society that's even more divided than it is now.
That's the worry. And it highlights why this isn't just about whether we can boost intelligence, but also whether we should, and if so, how do we do it in a way that benefits everyone?
It's a heavy thing to think about. If you were put in charge of a research program focused on making humans smarter, where would you focus your efforts? What would be your top priorities?
That's a great question. Honestly, if I were designing that program, I'd focus on a multi-pronged approach. First off, I'd pour resources into really understanding the biological basis of intelligence. We've made progress, but we still have huge gaps in our knowledge about how the brain creates complex thought. We need a much deeper understanding how it all works before we start trying to fundamentally alter it.
It's like trying to soup up a car's engine without knowing how all the parts fit together.
Exactly. So deep dive into the neuroscience, for sure. But my second priority would be equally important: researching the ethical and societal impacts of making humans smarter. We need to get a handle on the potential risks, not just the benefits, and develop strong ethical guidelines for this kind of research.
So ethics alongside the science every step of the way.
Absolutely. We can't just tack on the ethics at the end as an afterthought. And finally, I'd put a lot of energy into developing methods for enhancing human intelligence that are safe, effective, and fair. That means exploring lots of different approaches, but always prioritizing safety, accessibility, and long-term sustainability.
So not putting all our eggs in one basket, making sure these technologies are available to everyone, not just a select few.
Exactly. And I can't overstate how important public engagement will be in all of this. These technologies have the potential to reshape our world, and we need to bring the public along for the ride. Open, honest discussions about the benefits and risks of intelligence amplification are crucial, making sure everyone has a say in shaping the future.
It's a huge undertaking, but also an incredibly exciting time to be alive. We're talking about potentially changing what it means to be human, and it's up to us to approach this with both wisdom and a sense of responsibility.
I couldn't agree more. We're writing the future of human intelligence, and we all have a part to play in shaping that story.
I love that. To our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into human intelligence amplification. We've explored the potential benefits, the risks, the ethical challenges, and the mind-blowing possibilities that lie ahead. As we continue pushing the limits of what humans are capable of, let's do it responsibly with a deep awareness of the future we're creating. Until next time, keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and keep striving to build a smarter, kinder world.